We continue today with exposition of the book of Romans. We have now come to the final part or text of the book of Romans, chapter 1. Today I would like to read verse 28 through to the end of the chapter. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Paul has been laboring the question of the wrath of God and defining the wrath of God as a process of apostasy. In other words, those who turn away from God and plunge themselves to the lusts of their hearts, they are already under God's judgment. And that is his definition of the wrath of God that he begins to describe from chapter 1, verse 18. I will not go through every other vice that he has spoken about, except that when you get to verse 28, Paul lumps together multiple vices, and he introduces these vices by explaining that the door is wide open to these vices. The door is left wide open only because they refused to retain God in their knowledge. Again, Paul started in verse 18 by telling us that this ungodly and unrighteous generation, it does not begin by rejecting God altogether. It begins by suppressing the truth of God. It begins by picking and choosing what is suitable, and what it feels is unsuitable, it leaves out. And so the suppression of the truth of God is not a wholesome rejection of the law of God. But I have also labored the point that first step to suppressing the truth of God becomes full-blown wickedness as you go along. Following that kind of arrogance and pride against the Creator, we then have a follow-up or a logical consequence emerging from it. And I have also explained that has a lot to do with increasing neglect of the glory of God, idolatry, sexual immorality. And when you get to verse 28, as I just said, then we are told that when we refuse to retain the knowledge of God, whether in our minds or in our public sphere, whether in our politics or our society, whether in our homes or anywhere that we interact or platforms that we interact with, when we refuse to retain the knowledge of God, when God is replaced with idols and the worship of the true God is replaced with increasing idolatry, what we find is more than sexual immorality, as I said in our last episode. So here we are told that God gives the unrighteous and ungodly over to a debased mind. There's only one place that you can go if you refuse to retain the knowledge of God, and that is to a place of darkness, of a debased mind, one that loses all dignity and profile that God Himself equipped it with. And so we are told that when we refuse to retain that knowledge of God and we are given over to a debased mind, we do things that are unfitting. Let's then not be surprised, dear beloved, when we see things unfitting in our society today. The genesis of these things is a failure to retain the knowledge of God in our lives, in our hearts and communities, in our schools and churches, and in our public sphere. When we refuse to retain that knowledge of God, we turn to things unfitting. And then Paul goes on and begins to explain from verse 29 that we are no longer experiencing sprinkles of wickedness, but he says that we are filled. Notice here the liberality. Notice here the abundance. Again, the progression from suppressing the truth of God, of picking and choosing, to this point of no return, where now there is abundance of unrighteousness, abundance of the breaking and violation of what God does not approve. And so verse 29 tells us that we are filled with all unrighteousness. This has a lot to do with both the depth and the breadth of it. And by that I mean that we have no restraint, that the depth of our sin knows no bounds. But also it means that, as he would say later, we even invent evil, that we have no restraint because we have refused to retain the knowledge of God in our minds and in our hearts. And when he begins to list the vices, one would only cringe to a society that has no moral control. And so he begins by listing sexual immorality at the top of the list. I would like to caution that in the original version, sexual immorality does not feature in that list. This, however, does not mean that sexual immorality does not form part of that unrighteousness. I have already labored that point. But he talks about wickedness. And wickedness has a lot to do with evil desires. Desiring things that are ungodly. Being excited and delighting in things that only lead to ruin of society and of our lives. And so he follows wickedness or evil desires with covetousness, greed, malice, envy, murder is among them, strife, tensions and conflict, deceit and lack of truth. There it is, because we have abandoned He who is the truth, the way and the life. He goes on to explain that we find also evil-mindedness, backbiting. Backbiting is part, and when we are filled with backbiting, it is part of being filled with unrighteousness, because we have refused to retain the knowledge of God. And then he includes in that list haters of God. And friends, that's our society today. That those who refuse to love God, they can only hate Him. There is no neutrality. There is no middle ground. That we hate God if we do not love Him. If we do not want to retain God in our knowledge, we can only live in a debased mind that hates Him. Violent and proud and boasters, inventing evil things. Again, he includes in that list disobedient to parents. For how can we obey God who is unseen if we cannot obey parents who represent God's order, who are God's idea for us, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, and unforgiving, without mercy? What I want you to see there is the extent of sin, the depth and the breadth of sin. The fact that now Paul talks about the liberality, that we are no longer testing initial or orthodox ideas of sin, but plunging into that which is even unspeakable, that which is evil, inventing new things in pursuit of a freedom from God Himself. In verse 12, he says, knowing the righteous judgment of God. I want to point out that even then, even when the world turns away from God and hates God, even when our generation plunges into ruin and are filled with unrighteousness, inventing new sins every day, that will never negate the judgment of God. That is already, as I said, a sign of judgment, but is only a sign of what is to come. What is to come is a greater judgment than what is now. And God's righteous judgment will still ultimately pronounce guilty those unrighteous and those ungodly who do not retain the knowledge of God. Paul goes on to say that those who practice these things are deserving of death. Notice the logical consequence. He uses the word deserving. And when you hear people say, I do not deserve to die, they really have no idea of the justice of God. Because the justice of God demands that in the end, you get paid the wages you have earned. And Paul will have a lot to say later on in Romans chapter 6. And so when we do these things, and he goes on to say, not just doing, but when we approve of these things, we might not ourselves conduct ourselves in these ways, but he says if deep in our hearts we approve of these things, then that means we hate God. That means we too do not retain the knowledge of God in our minds. And we too would be deserving of death according to Scripture. I would like to conclude by suggesting to you that the things that I have just read, the vices that I have listed, as we have seen from verse 28 and following, it speaks to secularism and a lot of the isms that exist in our world today, of banishing religion from public sphere and condemning it to a private sphere, of demanding that Christianity step down from its exalted place in our hearts and society. Refusing to retain the knowledge of God can only lead us to this disastrous society that, as we have just seen, is now ready for the final judgment. Again, it's important for us to underscore the fact that our society is characterized by all these things. It is a sign of God's judgment that our society is at the point it is now of these vices, of inventing evil, of perversions. But it is also a sign that it is now ready for God's final judgment.